Good morning. I am Dr. Tariq Kader. Today we're going to talk about sun exposure. For decades, sun exposure has been demonized. We were told to stay out of the sun at all costs. But what if this message is incomplete or inaccurate? Today we're going to unpack the science behind that and what does the sun really do to our bodies, to our mitochondria, immune system, sleep, and even cancer risk. First off, the first study I came across, people who are exposed to the sun for longer durations of time had an all-cause mortality reduction compared to people who did not. A lot of the data related to mortality came from a major study, which is melanoma in southern Sweden cohort. And the data that were extrapolated from that study showed that women who avoided sunlight have a more likelihood of dying early than women who did not avoid the sun and they were exposed to the sun. There are a lot of data, a lot of good data out of that study showing both the risks and the benefits. Now, that comes down to many factors and many causes and many disease prevention. We're going to unpack as much as possible out of that today. The first one we're going to talk about is insulin resistance and diabetes type 2. And everybody knows that I am a firm believer that insulin resistance is one, if not the major issue for the majority of chronic diseases that are prevalent today. So there have been studies that looked at the relationship between insulin resistance, diabetes type 2, and glucose intolerance to vitamin D levels. And supplementation with vitamin D, some of them showed benefit, some of them did not. But the studies that looked specifically at the vitamin D elevation related to sun exposure, these studies were consistent with the benefit. People who had higher vitamin D levels because of sun exposure had a less likelihood of developing insulin resistance, diabetes type 2, glucose intolerance, in other words, metabolic syndrome. That led us to believe that there are other factors related to sun exposure besides vitamin D that are causing the benefits. The second thing is mood disorders and depression. Studies were consistent that sun exposure, the longer people are outside in the sun, the likelihood of mood disorders and depression and depressive symptoms is much less. Now, a very important thing we focus a lot in our longevity clinic and a lot of people focus a lot on, and that is sleep. Fixing sleeping cycles. I'm not talking about obstructive sleep apnea here. The sleep cycle, the circadian rhythm. Fixing all that, a lot of the times, does not start at nighttime, it starts in the morning time. So the studies were consistently finding that morning sun exposure, that time before 10 in the morning, the longer the sun exposure at that time, the more improvement in sleep quality and the reduction in sleep latency. So sleep latency is the amount of time required for you to fall asleep from the moment you go into your bed. That comes from most likely improvement in circadian rhythm and setting the circadian rhythm right. So when you go out there in the morning, you are exposed to the sun, the back of the eye, which is the retina, has special cells. These cells will fire electrical signals once exposed to the sun, going back to the brain, to the master pacemaker. And that master pacemaker is going to send other signals to the body through hormones, through melatonin, through autonomic nervous system signals, and other complex pathways to basically wake up the body and get ready for the day. And this sets the cortisol right and the melatonin right and sets your day right in a way that is matching the biological daytime. Now, how about cancer risk? So, yes, there is a risk for skin cancer, but the risk has been more associated with history of sunburns and prolonged exposures that happen occasionally that result in sunburns, that significant redness and skin peeling that develops after spending so much time in the sun. So the history of sunburns has been associated with a much higher incidence of melanomas and skin cancers compared to when we looked at just chronic exposure to sunlight. Now, how about the rest of the cancers? Through a lot of mechanisms, most likely related to nitrous oxide production, anti-inflammatory cascade, and other immune modulation, we saw consistent improvement in the incidences of colon cancer, breast cancer, and lymphomas. Other studies actually showed the benefits of the sun exposure regardless of the vitamin D levels. So vitamin D supplementation and elevated vitamin D levels from supplementation did not reproduce the same results that we saw from the improvements in the cancer profile and cancer incidences when we looked at overall sun exposure regardless of vitamin D. How about sunscreen? Yes, Sunscreen is important, especially if we're going to spend time not early in the morning. We're talking about late morning and early afternoons. But we have to make our choices of sunscreens cautiously. We should not be using any chemical that causes any endocrine disruption. The majority of sunscreens out there are endocrine disrupting chemicals, so they cause a lot of chemical changes resulting in an alteration in hormonal level receptors, result in a lot of negative health effects. In fact, some of these chemicals were actually found in the blood as this seeps through the skin. Unlike the mineral-based, like zinc and titanium-based sunscreens that do not penetrate through the skin. Now, even if it's cold and you have a layer of clothes on, you're going to get some sun penetration through the clothes. So I do still think that even on a cloudy day, even if it's a little cold, a little bit of sun exposure in the morning time is going to be a lot more helpful than you think. If you like this video and found it useful, and you would like to hear more about longevity hacks and information, like, subscribe, and share, and stay tuned for more.